Hello, I'm Scott Campbell. I retired from the Air Force at the rank of colonel in 2020 after 25 years of active duty service. On 9/11, I was located at Osan Air Base in the Republic of Korea. We had just finished night flying, and as I returned to my dorm room, I turned the morning news back on in the States as we were 12 hours ahead. And I turned it on just in time to see the second aircraft hit the Twin Towers. A very close friend of mine in the squadron called me up to inform me that the Pentagon had been hit, as his father was stationed there at that time. We didn't know exactly what to do, what this meant. We immediately returned to the squadron, where we were given orders to back all of the aircraft into the hardened aircraft shelters, as no one really knew what was happening. The next morning on 9/12, I woke up to a rather bizarre sight. We had a Patriot missile battery that sat at Osan, and normally all of the missiles were pointed north towards the threat. This morning I woke up and the Patriots were arrayed in a 360-degree pattern, facing all directions, as no one really knew where the threat might come from. And as we went about our business in the coming weeks and things began to sort themselves out, we felt like we were going to miss out because we were in Korea. And at that time, the jets didn't leave the peninsula. We had 4 fighter squadrons between Osan and Kunsan, 1 A-10 squadron and 3 F-16 squadrons. But we didn't leave. We didn't even leave for exercises. The jets always remained on the peninsula. So we really felt like this fight that felt very personal, that we wanted to be a part of, that we were going to miss out on it. And then in January 2002, I returned from Osan to Pope Air Force Base, my next assignment with the 74th Fighter Squadron. And as we arrived, the squadron was getting ready to spin up to deploy to the Middle East. Not part of Operation Enduring Freedom, but a standard Southern Watch rotation. The A-10s in the decade after Desert Storm were routinely stationed at Al Jaber Air Base to do combat search and rescue support and provide close air support if required should the Iraqis come south again. So we were told very clearly we were going for combat search and rescue alert and that we were going to be no part of the fight in Afghanistan. I deployed as a flight commander and as the squadron weapons officer for our squadron. We arrived, settled in, like every other Southern Watch deployment. At the time, in February 2002, we had a number of squadrons stationed at Al Jaber to include F-15Es from Seymour Johnson, F-16s from Eielson Air Force Base, and we also had a Marine Corps F-18D squadron. We began our normal alert schedule, getting the jets ready every day, flying some training lines. The rest of the squadrons located at Al Jaber were flying routine missions up into Afghanistan. However, there was no kinetic operations at the time. Since Tora Bora in December of 2001, things had pretty much gone quiet. And then late in February, we began to hear about a large conventional operation that was developing called Operation Anaconda. Again, we were told we would be no part of this mission set. And as Anaconda kicked off, it started out very poorly, to say the least. We had MH-47 shot down on top of a mountain called Takur Gar, which would later be known as Roberts Ridge, named after Petty Officer Neil Roberts. And up there we had soldiers, sailors, and airmen fighting for their lives on top of that mountain against an entrenched enemy. Meanwhile, on the valley floor below, the intelligence on the enemy's location and strength was wildly off. And as a result, the 3 Army battalions that had been committed to this operation immediately came under contact and were forced to start to withdraw from their initial positions where they were brought in by helicopter. As you would expect, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps, Army Organic Assets, everyone responded as we had multiple units declaring troops in contact. At the time, the Combined Forces Air Component Commander was General Moseley, and he committed every asset he could to the fight, which was constrained in a very small area, approximately 5 kilometers by 9 kilometers. And as this began to unfold after the first day, I was called into the mission planning cell and alerted that General Moseley was committing the A-10s because this had quickly devolved into a full-blown close air support fight, something that we were cut out for. And as such, I was given a quick rundown on the situation and told, jump into pilot rest, showed up the next morning, got a quick briefing on the ins and outs of getting up to Afghanistan, as we had not done this at all. We had not looked at the rules of engagement. We didn't know the procedures. And my wingman, K9 Kostelnik, and I jumped in the jets and took off. And after 5 hours and multiple air refuelings, we finally arrived on scene. And when we got there, it was definitely a scene of chaos. The Air Force had not been training, generally speaking, to close air support for the decade after Desert Storm, as we continued to draw down our fighter squadrons, and we were completely oriented on Iraq, both Southern Watch and Northern Watch. And as such, most of the aircraft that were now involved in this fight were not tasked and did not train to close air support. In fact, it was mainly limited to RA-10s, the Eielson F-16s, which were a Block 40 unit, and the Marine Corps Hornets. And it required all hands on deck, and so it was a pickup game, and everyone was doing their best to execute. And as we got in, we quickly realized another area that we were deficient in was from a command and control perspective, because a lot of what we'd been doing in Southern Watch and Northern Watch was oriented on large packages going in all at once, a lot of the things that we trained to or had trained to in Red Flag. But now, all of a sudden, we were just pumping as many aircraft into a very small piece of airspace that had over 37 different JTAC positions on the ground, all on different frequencies, unable to doctrinally execute because the Air Support Operations Center in Bagram didn't have line-of-sight communications with the Joint Terminal Attack Controllers on the ground. And as such, we quickly figured out that the airspace was not deconflicted whatsoever. We had bombs dropped through our altitude, through our orbit. We had aircraft crossing through our formation. We could tell there was just a complete lack of organization and control. And at the time, a lot of the things that we became exceptionally proficient at over 20 years as an Air Force with regards to close air support, at this time, those things didn't exist. There was no stack. There were no very common procedures that were known across the combat air forces, like brief stack mark, knowing a 9-line, giving an area of operations update. So as a result, where we fell into the role of forward air controllers. And we quickly jumped on and took control of the airspace from the AWACS crew, with my wingman operating as a tactical air coordinator, checking the aircraft in, getting them to safe deconflicted altitudes, and then feeding them into the airspace where I would either conduct terminal attack control or hand them off to an appropriate JTAC based on their weapons and their gas. And so we executed this for a solid week, and we were operating out of a classified location at the time of Jacobabad, Pakistan. And this was the closest they could get our aircraft to the fight because all the runways were inoperable for fighters within Afghanistan itself. And so our squadron forward deployed and split, where we had aircraft forward deployed in Pakistan, aircraft still deployed in Kuwait conducting the Combat Search and Rescue Alert mission. And we operated with 5 aircraft out of Jacobabad for roughly a week. And we continued to support the fight in Anaconda, both with close air support and as forward air controllers. And the lesson that we learned along the way was the value of having those forward air controllers to take the load off of our airborne command and control assets, who were very busy running aircraft up and down the boulevard from the Gulf into Afghanistan, and then also constantly feeding them in and out of tanker tracks to keep as many aircraft on station at any time to support the ground forces below. Following Anaconda, we redeployed back to Kuwait. And we figured at this stage we were going to reorient back to the Southern Watch mission as a squadron. But based on the situation in Afghanistan with Anaconda and the support that we were able to provide the Army, the land component commander wanted A-10s as close to the fight as possible. And so a plan began to open Bagram for fighters. At the time, we had airlifters coming in and out of it, as the runway was about 5,000 foot of usable runway, and at that density altitude, far too short for A-10s, fully laden with weapons, and higher temperatures as we were getting closer to spring. So an effort was made, and the engineers went in, and they were able to open the full length of the runway, roughly 9,000 feet, but only half the width. And the other half of the width had been bombed out in the opening days of Operation Enduring Freedom. We had no lights on the runway. We had no instrument approaches, but the sense of urgency was to get our aircraft in there as soon as possible. So we had to operate with the bare minimums to be able to at least provide support during the day as we worked to enhance the runway and get those things like instrument approaches and lighting up and running, which wouldn't happen for some time, certainly while we were there. And so we got the jets in there as quickly as we could. It was very austere conditions. We put general purpose tents up behind the old Russian tower. We had this metal box that was flown in on a C-130 that operated as our mission planning cell. So it was pretty much the only workspace we had, and we made it happen. And our maintainers did an incredible job of creating a bomb dump out of sandbags and an old Russian bunker area. Horrible conditions on the taxiways and runways that really were chewing up the jets, but they did an awesome job of continuing to be able to generate sorties. And so we split the squadron, and we sent 8 jets up to Bagram to run operations up there, while leaving an additional 10 jets back at Al Jaber to continue to do the Southern Watch mission. And so we operated like that for the remainder of our deployment, and then we turned it over to a reserve unit that took over from us from New Orleans and from Whiteman as we redeployed back to the States. I would not return to Afghanistan for well over a decade. In September 2013, I arrived at Kandahar Airfield as the 451st Expeditionary Operations Group Commander. At the time, we were retrograding across Afghanistan. Ground forces were coming out of combat outposts and forward operating bases and falling back into our larger main operating bases like Kandahar and Bagram. As such, air power was going through a lot of change at the time as well, and I would see a lot of movement of aircraft during my time at Kandahar. Initially, when I showed up, I had gotten checked out in the MQ-9 Reaper. I was both mission crew element qualified as well as launch and recovery element qualified. The forward deployed squadron at Kandahar had 72 MQ-1 and MQ-9 aircraft, with 20 of them forward deployed in Jalalabad. And at the time, the primary mission of that squadron was to do launch and recovery. So they would launch the aircraft, get them up to altitude, and then the crews back in the States would then take control of the aircraft to execute the missions. And then we would do the opposite. As the aircraft returned to base, our launch and recovery element would then grab the aircraft and bring them in to land using line of sight as the preferred method to put them on the ground. In addition to the RPAs, the remotely piloted aircraft that we had in our ops group, we had 12 F-16s, we had 8 C-130Js, 4 E-11 Bacon aircraft, 18 MC-12 Liberties, and then additional aircraft that we had that weren't directly under the operations group, but we integrated into our operations were 2 King Air Blue Devil contract ISR aircraft and 2 WB-57 aircraft on loan from NASA. At the time, we also had an expeditionary rescue group that had a separate commander out at Camp Bastion in Helmand Province. Daily operations, as you might imagine, were 24/7, doing close air support, air mobility, and then a lot of intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance based on the aircraft we had there located at Kandahar.